In the year 1324, a man walked across the desert and broke the global economy. He gave away so much gold that its value crashed for over a decade. Sultans stared in disbelief. Cairo's markets fell into chaos. Historians who witnessed it could barely find the words to describe what they had seen. This is not legend. This is history. And for centuries, the world tried to forget it. Before we go back 900 years into the sands of an empire the world tried to erase from memory, hit subscribe, because what you are about to see will change how you think about power, wealth, and Africa's forgotten throne. Stay until the end because the final minutes reveal how his fortune still echoes through the modern world. West Africa, the 14th century. Long before Europe's great empires reached their peak, a kingdom rose along the Niger River that would become the wealthiest state on earth. It was called the Mali Empire, and at its height, it stretched across more territory than Western Europe itself. It controlled the gold fields of Bambouk and Bouré, the salt mines of the Sahara, and the trade routes that connected the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean world. Camel caravans moved endlessly across the desert, carrying gold north and salt south, and every grain of it passed through Mali's hands. Yet, in most history books written outside Africa, this empire barely exists. Its cities are footnotes, its rulers are strangers, and the man who sat on the throne in the 14th century remains to this day one of the most powerful human beings the world has never properly learned about. His name was Mansa Musa. He did not begin his reign in the way kings usually do. Musa rose to power after the mysterious disappearance of his predecessor, Abu Bakr II, a ruler said to have launched a fleet of ships west across the Atlantic Ocean in search of what lay beyond it. Abu Bakr never returned. Whether his ships were lost to storms or simply swallowed by the unknown, no one can say for certain. What is certain is that the throne passed to Musa, and with it, control over one of the most resource-rich empires in the medieval world. Mali was not built on gold alone. It was built on war. Musa inherited a militarized trading state, one where the flow of wealth depended entirely on the ability to control territory and defend it. Under his rule, Mali's armies expanded the empire's borders further than ever before. He led campaigns that absorbed the city of Gao and brought the Songhai people under Mali's control, extending the empire's reach deep into the heart of West Africa. Cavalry units, iron weaponry, and a disciplined military structure allowed Mali to dominate rival kingdoms and secure the trade routes that made its wealth possible. This is a detail often lost in the way Musa is remembered. He is remembered as a man of gold, a man of generosity, a man of faith. But before any of that, he was a warrior king who expanded and defended an empire through conquest. The gold mines meant nothing without soldiers to protect them. The trade routes meant nothing without an army to secure them. Musa's wealth was inseparable from his war machine. By the time Musa had consolidated his power, Mali controlled nearly half of the old world's gold supply. Merchants from North Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe depended on Malian gold to fuel their economies. And yet, despite this staggering influence, much of the outside world had never heard his name. That was about to change. In 1324, Mansa Musa made a decision that would transform him from a regional power into a global legend. He announced his intention to complete the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, a religious obligation for any Muslim capable of making the journey. For Musa, this was more than an act of faith. It was a declaration to the world. He intended to travel across the desert, through Cairo into Arabia, and he intended for every person who saw him to understand exactly how powerful the Empire of Mali truly was. What followed became one of the most extraordinary journeys in recorded history. Musa did not travel light. According to historical accounts written by scholars who witnessed the procession, his caravan stretched for miles across the desert. Estimates placed the number of people traveling with him at around 60,000, including soldiers, officials, scholars, and servants. Hundreds of camels carried supplies, and according to multiple historical sources, roughly 100 of them were loaded with pure gold. Enslaved attendants dressed in fine silk and brocade walked alongside the procession. Horses adorned in gold ornaments marched in formation. It was less a pilgrimage than a moving empire, a deliberate, calculated display of dominance stretching across the sands. This was not simply wealth. This was strategy. Musa understood that the journey would take him through cities controlled by other rulers, cities filled with merchants, scholars, and spies who would carry word of what they witnessed back to their own kings. Every city he passed through became a stage. Every gift he distributed became a message. Mali was not a distant, unknown kingdom on the edge of the map. Mali was a power the world needed to reckon with. Nowhere was this more evident than in Cairo. When Musa's caravan arrived in the Egyptian capital, one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the medieval world, he did something that no visiting monarch had done before. He began giving away gold. Enormous quantities of it. He distributed it to the poor, to religious scholars, to local officials, to anyone he encountered along his path. He built mosques. He funded projects. He spent and gave so freely that the flow of gold into Cairo's economy became overwhelming. The consequences were immediate and severe. Historical accounts from Arab scholars, most notably the historian Al-Umari, who gathered testimony from Cairo residents years after the event, describe how the sudden flood of gold caused its value to collapse. The price of gold in Cairo and the surrounding region reportedly did not recover for more than a decade. Musa had not just displayed his wealth. He had, quite literally, destabilized an economy simply by passing through it. Imagine the scene. Merchants who had built their fortunes on the value of gold, watching that value disintegrate within weeks. Money changers scrambling to understand what was happening. Scholars in Cairo's great libraries writing down descriptions of a foreign king they could barely comprehend. A man from a kingdom most of them had never heard of, arriving with more gold than the treasuries of established empires. Word of Musa's journey spread far beyond Cairo. It reached the courts of Europe. It reached Venetian and Genoese traders whose ships carried word further still. Decades later, European mapmakers would depict Mansa Musa on the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world, showing him seated on a throne, crowned, holding a golden scepter and a massive gold nugget, with the inscription identifying him as the richest and noblest ruler of the entire region. This was a European document, created by people who had never set foot in Mali, yet even they understood that Musa's power could not be ignored. He had, in the span of a single pilgrimage, made himself one of the most famous rulers on the planet, without ever picking up a sword on foreign soil. His wealth alone had done what most kings could only accomplish through decades of warfare. He had made the world stop and stare. But Musa's ambitions did not end with spectacle. On his return journey from Mecca, he brought back something arguably more valuable than the gold he had given away. He brought back knowledge. Musa recruited scholars, architects, and religious teachers from Cairo and the wider Islamic world, and brought them back to Mali. Among them was the celebrated architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, credited with helping to design new structures throughout the empire, including the famous Jingarebe Mosque in the city of Timbuktu. Under Musa's rule, Timbuktu transformed from a regional trading post into one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. Scholars flocked to the city. Manuscripts on law, astronomy, medicine, and Islamic theology filled its libraries. The Sankor institution, which would later become closely associated with Timbuktu's reputation as a center of scholarship, developed under the intellectual momentum Musa's reign had set in motion. At a time when much of Europe was still emerging from centuries of intellectual stagnation, Timbuktu was producing scholars, manuscripts, and legal texts that rivaled the great universities of the known world. None of this existed in isolation from war. The empire's ability to fund mosques, libraries, and scholars depended entirely on continued military strength. Rival kingdoms watched Mali's wealth with envy, and Musa's successors would spend years defending the borders his conquests had drawn. The Golden Age of Timbuktu existed because Malian soldiers stood guard over trade routes, gold mines, and city walls. Learning and warfare were two sides of the same empire. Mansa Musa ruled for roughly a quarter of a century, reigning over an empire at the absolute height of its power and influence. When he died, sometime in the 1330s, he left behind the kingdom larger, wealthier, and more internationally recognized than any other in the region's history. But like so many empires built around the single dominant ruler, Mali's strength began to fracture without him. His successors struggled to maintain the same balance of military force and administrative control that Musa had mastered. Rival factions emerged. Songhai, once absorbed into the empire through conquest, would eventually break away and rise as a competing power. Over the following century, the Mali Empire slowly contracted, losing territory, losing influence, and losing the extraordinary wealth that had once made it the envy of the medieval world. Then came the centuries of colonization. As European powers expanded into Africa from the 15th century onward, the historical narratives written about the continent shifted dramatically. African kingdoms, their achievements, their scholarship, their military and economic power were minimized, distorted, or erased entirely from the historical record taught in Western institutions. The story of a king whose wealth had once destabilized the economy of Cairo, whose empire had produced some of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world, was buried beneath centuries of narratives that portrayed Africa as a continent without history. For hundreds of years, Mansa Musa existed mostly in the footnotes of Arabic manuscripts and the margins of medieval European maps, while empires with far less relative influence dominated the history books taught in schools around the world. It is only in recent decades, through renewed historical research and the rediscovery of primary sources from Arab historians and Malian oral tradition, that Musa's story has begun to reach wider audiences again. Modern economists, attempting to calculate the scale of his fortune using contemporary measures, have repeatedly placed him among the wealthiest individuals in human history, with some estimates suggesting his personal wealth would be almost impossible to translate into modern currency, given that he did not merely possess gold, he controlled nearly half of its global supply at the time. But the true significance of Mansa Musa's story is not simply the size of his fortune. It is what that fortune represented. It is proof that West Africa was not a peripheral region on the edge of world history, but a center of trade, scholarship, military power, and cultural achievement that rivaled anything in Europe or the Middle East during the same period. It is proof that the story of global power in the medieval world cannot be fully understood without understanding the empire he ruled. Mansa Musa did not need to conquer distant land to leave the world speechless. He simply walked through it, and the world could not look away. Mansa Musa did not just carry gold across a desert. He carried proof that Africa's history is far greater than most were ever taught. If this documentary opened your eyes, subscribe, share it with someone who has never heard his name, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten king or empire deserves to be uncovered next. The truth is still out there, buried under centuries of silence, but it is not gone.